How'd you like to listen to .NET Rocks with no ads? Easy. Become a patron. For just $5 a month, you get access to a private RSS feed where all the shows have no ads. $20 a month will get you that and a special .NET Rocks patron mug. Sign up now at patreon.netrocks.com.
Hey, Carl and Richard here. As you may have heard, NDC is back, offering their incredible in-person conferences around the world, and we'd like to tell you about them.
NDC Oslo will be May 21st through the 25th. Go to ndcoslo.com to register.
NDC Copenhagen is happening August 27th through the 31st. The early bird discount for NDC Copenhagen ends June 2nd. Go to ndccopenhagen.com for more information.
NDC Porto is happening October 16th through the 20th. The early bird discount for NDC Porto ends July 21st. Go to ndcporto.com to register.
And check out the full lineup of conferences at ndcconferences.com. Welcome back to .NET Rocks. This is Carl Franklin.
And this is Richard Campbell.
In our respective corners of North America.
Mm-hmm.
How you doing, buddy? What's up?
Raining. Lots of rain.
Oh.
But, you know.
At least it's not freezing.
No, it's not freezing anymore. It warmed up.
Yeah.
But, yeah, you know, it's spring season.
Have the bears come out yet?
Oh, yeah. No, the bears are around. No question. We've actually had a full-size mountain lion wandering around, evading Fish and Wildlife quite successfully because they really don't like having 90-pound cats walking around the neighborhood. But
yeah,
I've got a good shot of her headed back out into the backyard and into the forest behind me, but plenty of other neighbors gotten shots of her as well. So
you know that story about Roy Rogers and Dale Evans? Dale Evans got Roy Rogers a new pair of boots for Easter. And he went out hunting, and he comes across this mountain lion, which jumped at him, and he pulled out his pistol and shot it dead. But before the cat died, it just completely, fought. He had to fight it off, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it tore the crap out of his boots. So he slings it over his back, and he comes walking up the laneway, and Dale Evans is on the porch, and she says, "Pardon me, Roy. Is that the cat that chewed your new shoes?"
Oh, man. That was a long way to go.
Oh, boy. Okay. Well, anyway, let's start the show with Better Know Framework.
All right, bud, what do you got?
This being episode 1845, if you go to 1845.pwop.me, you will see a tweet from one McKay Wrigley.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, "Jarvis is now reality. My GPT-4 coding assistant can now build and deploy brand new web apps. It initializes my project, builds my app, creates a GitHub repo, and deploys it to Vercel. All from simply using my voice."
Cool.
And he's got a video there. And I just thought this was really telling. And I remember, you probably may or may not remember this because this might have been before you, but we were talking about automation and everything. And I was saying, someday you'll be able to just walk up to a computer and have a conversation with it in regular language, and it will spit out a fully functional business logic included app or whatever. And whoever was on the line that day said, "No, that's not going to happen. That'll never happen."
Well,
and
I don't know that it has happened.
I don't know that it has either. But
air quotes fully functional. Like near as I can tell, you've managed to build a DevOps. You put a chat interface on top of a DevOps engine.
Okay, so are you saying that this is never going to happen?
I think never is a funny word, right?
Nice hedge.
Well, eventually the sun expands and incinerates the planet too. So
right.
What context do you want never in?
Okay. How about in our lifetime, do you think someone will be able to walk up to a computer, have a conversation, have the thing say, "Okay, what happens when they press this button?" And you say it, and then it spits out let's say 90% of a completed application.
Yeah. We've already had that technology
In our lifetime.
It's just a question of, was it good enough? Because it's also a moving goalpost. Right?
Right.
Once upon a time, as long as it rendered 80 by 25 text in a green screen, it was good enough.
Yeah.
Right? Now I expect it to be on a phone, on a tablet, on a PC, works in the cloud, works at home. Like expectations keep shifting.
True.
So as long as that momentum is maintained, and one would argue we've been stuck in the same form factors for quite a while now.
Yeah. I guess it also depends on the nature of the app, right? If it's just forms over data, I can see that happening. But if it's, got something that you need to hire a CSS guru for because it has to be pixel perfect, that's going to be hard.
It depends on what the visualizations are. Right?
Yeah, it's going to be hard to describe.
But look at the chat interface on top of Power Platform for forms over data where you can describe your intent.
Yeah. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, no, it's very exciting.
Well, anyway, that's what I got.
We are very much in a hype cycle right now, friend.
Yes, we are. All right, so who's talking to us today?
I grabbed a comment off of show 1566, so I'm going back a bit. That's the show we did in July of 2018 with Corey House, talking about GraphQL, although we did talk a fair bit about Entity Framework in relation to GraphQL. And this particular comment comes from Mike Bateman, who said, "Hey, guys, longtime listener, first comment." And we only waited 6 years to read it. 5. I work for a big company building APIs where we do REST, but not all the verbs. Nobody does all the verbs. OData, and a little blend of both. I love this episode. It dug into issues we face as API builders and consumers. I'm glad that OData has been talked about again, as we've been using it for years, both internally and externally. And my first impression of GraphQL, I thought it was a ripoff of OData, which it's not. It's its own thing. However, as I dug into the detail of GraphQL, I found it to be more mature, better supported, and UI tooling is a massive help. The notification and subscription feature caught my attention too. And this is 5 years ago. GraphQL's improved since then. We have lots of SQL databases and Entity Framework models coded up and using GraphQL.NET library, which made building GraphQL services much quicker and easier than OData. And as for depth and intense querying issues, those exist in OData too. We were hit on a Saturday afternoon with some crazy OData queries that actually took down our SQL servers. Always on a Saturday afternoon,
right,
man. That's the way that works. I'm sad that OData wasn't endorsed as much as GraphQL when it first came out, but I'm glad GraphQL is here and would encourage our fellow .NET devs to consider it when building an API. XML?
Yeah.
No thanks.
No thanks.
Jason? Yes, please.
More of that, please.
Great work and keep it up. Oh, great work to you too, Mike. Sorry it took me 5 years to read this comment because it's awesome.
Yeah. Yeah.
And yeah, isn't it fascinating how data has evolved and the way we're working these days? Although it seems pretty stable at the moment. Like we've got a good stack running with us.
And props to Doug Crockford.
Totally.
Yeah.
So, Mike, thank you so much for your comment, and a copy of Music to Code By is on its way to you. And if you'd like a copy of Music to Code By, write a comment on the website, .netrocks.com, or on the Facebooks. We read every one of them, and we comment on a few. And when we read that comment, I'll send you a copy of Music to Code By.
Hey, and definitely follow us on Twitter. That's all fine and good. But you should think about following us on Mastodon, because that's where the fun is happening these days. I'm at Carl Franklin at techhub.social.
And I'm at Rich Campbell at mastodon.social.
Send us a toot. We like getting them. And, if you send us a toot that's a comment on the show, we'll read it just like we do when you post it on Facebooks and all that other stuff. Right?
Absolutely.
All right. And with that, let me try to pronounce Erik's last name and middle name and not screw it up. Erik Ejlskov Jensen. How's that?
Perfect.
All right. He is a principal consultant at Delegate AS. He maintains a number of open source data access tools and libraries, including EF Core Power Tools and SQLite Toolbox for Visual Studio, and multiple entity framework providers. He's been awarded Microsoft MVP 14 times and enjoys running comic books and walking his dog. So do you run the comic books and walk the dog, or do you walk the comic books and run the dog?
I try to do it in separate boxes.
There's a comma there. I'm sorry.
Eat shoots and leaves.
Yeah.
Let's eat, Grandma.
Fair enough. Maybe I missed a comma. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, welcome to .NET Rocks. It's great to have you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for having me.
Recently, I brought up Entity Framework as being, I made a joke about it, being a wrapper around some exception or something like that. And only because I have a little pain with ND Framework, and I'm hoping that you might be able to help me answer the question that I have, but I'll get to that a little bit later. First, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us about what you've been working on lately?
Yeah, my name is Erik Ejlskov Jensen, as you said, and I work as a consultant and create apps, usually custom apps running in Azure Cloud, based on native Azure App Services, and I frequently use SQL Server for those apps. It's, believe it or not, it's actually something that's still in use.
SQL Server is everywhere, man. That thing's never going away.
I doubt it. And there's quite a good offering called Azure SQL Database, which is everything is completely managed for you. You don't need to do backups. You don't need to worry about high availability because everything is already available in 3 copies, even for the cheapest stock keeping units and so on.
I've actually taken advantage of that before, where it's like, damn, I really need a backup of this database. Hey, wait a minute,
it's there.
There it is.
It's there. Don't go looking. No.
Yeah.
So yeah. And I often I like to be productive when I develop as well, and I think EF Core, Entity Framework Core, can really help in that respect. And I have, for the benefit of myself and in order to be even more productive, but also to help others, I have published some tools and some libraries to help developers be more productive. For example, EF Core Power Tools.
Mm-hmm.
So when EF Core was initiated together with .NET Core back in the day, I think that was like 2017, 16, around that time, the team didn't work on any graphical tooling because it was cross-platform. So the effort was spent on the runtime and performance optimization, and not on graphical tools for a particular platform, like Visual Studio on Windows, for example. So I grabbed that opportunity to publish EF Core Power Tools in agreement with the EF Core team, because they didn't want to have anything to do with it. And it actually makes you able to very quickly start using your database, your existing database, with EF Core by scaffolding the necessary classes and DB context mappings and so on. So you can, in a strongly typed fashion, can communicate with your database from C#.
This was obviously before that stuff was built into Visual Studio.
It's like for the F6 Classic, if you wish, there was you could create an EDMX in Visual Studio. But I mean, that was also very much bound to Visual Studio and Windows and that whole infrastructure, whereas .NET Core was really aimed at being cross-platform, of course, and addressing, so it should be able to run on all kind of other operating systems like Linux and Mac and so on.
I know it's a little bit crazy, but they actually open sourced Entity Framework before .NET Core.
I know, and actually contributed to that as well at that time. And I think, I'm not sure it was the first project that Microsoft really, where they really embraced open source. I think it was open source at the same time as .NET 4 something, but certainly they really embraced open source in a good way. It was run on something called Codeplex.
Yeah, we remember.
Which was before GitHub, back in the day.
Yeah.
But yes, but the team was really open towards contributions from community members, and was really helpful in providing guidance on how do I do this, because it's like they were using some weird source control system. It wasn't Git. I can't remember.
No, it was their own internal one, and it was bizarre.
Yeah, exactly. It was like homemade pre-Git something.
Well, and GitHub was the product that was the space that learned how to take contributors from externals and so forth. So when they were doing this through Codeplex, there really was no mechanism for that. Like if you were part of that, that's a great story too, because most of the groups that posted stuff onto Codeplex, they were building it internally, and then they were just sort of pushing the thing up to Codeplex to take feedback.
Yeah.
They were never really trying to get code from that. But you actually were trying to contribute back then.
Actually, somehow, I was struggling, but somehow I managed to contribute.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Did you contribute the code that we run now to do scaffolding for Entity Framework on .NET?
I have contributed to the code that is running today, the scaffolding for Entity Framework and other features, but in particular the scaffolding code I have contributed to because that is the basis I use for the visual tooling. The visual tooling is built on top of that.
Wow.
Of course, I didn't want to have to reinvent the wheel, and the basic framework provides like each provider, like a provider is something that addresses a particular database system like SQLite, SQL Server, Azure SQL, and Postgres and Oracle, whatever. And they each have the obligation to provide a model that describes the structure of a database that you pointed to. And so there's a common API for consuming a description of what the database schema looks like.
Wow.
So each provider already supplies that metadata mechanism, and of course I don't want to reinvent anything basically. So I'm using all those mechanisms that are built into the framework and building on top of that.
To me, what was important about what became Entity Framework Core, the open source version of Entity Framework, is that it's essentially the first time that a Microsoft team took an existing closed source property and made an open source version from it, which seems impossible. Like from the inside, when they succeeded at that, it was the most important piece of code, is that it was a mechanism that wasn't believed to be possible. Because, normal way that Microsoft builds code is they're covering it in patents all the time.
Right.
Every time you finish a feature, as a developer, you're basically sitting with a lawyer going through what you built and saying, is there a patent here? And you get bonuses based on how many little cubes you get for getting patents, right?
Yeah.
Can you not open source patented code?
Only if you release the patents. You're basically junking the patents.
So you're
doing that.
Forgetting about the patents.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so to open source Entity Framework, they unwound those.
Wow.
In a variety of ways. And should I ever finish this book and not actually die first, all the things they did is kind of madness, but it was profoundly important, but and not so much, again, not that they did it, but that the effect it had on the rest of the company.
Yeah.
Because the rest of the company was then suddenly you were allowed to consider the idea of taking existing code and open sourcing it. Before that, I don't think it had ever been done.
I think about Scott Guthrie, who championed the open source stuff in the cloud. And all of the patents in his office, you've seen them, right? I mean, they're hanging on the walls. They're in trophies and stuff. He's got like 100 patents or something or more.
Well, more. But plenty of Azure still closed source, right? There's only certain things that are open source.
I think we can assume that quite big parts of Azure is still closed source.
Yes, very much closed source.
Yeah.
But yeah, and the real answer to open sourcing .NET was to rewrite .NET.
Yeah.
So the patents may apply to the old code base, but which is still closed source.
But they actually is like from EF's Classic 5, which was completely closed source, and then they actually managed to build that in when they initiated in a Codeplex for version 6. And actually got at least one. I think there was more contributors than me. Not many, but there was some.
Wow.
But the fact that they took contributors through Codeplex to me is fascinating because it shows.
Yeah.
It pointed to the way forward, and the fact that they ultimately moved away from Codeplex and onto GitHub, that was far better suited to that problem.
Absolutely, and of course they realized that when they started .NET Core that was a appropriate platform for doing things like that.
Well, SignalR, I think, was the first, although it was started as a GitHub project and then became part of Microsoft later. But it certainly was a demonstration of contribution.
Yeah.
Well, should we get back to Entity Framework? I suppose.
Sorry.
Dude, I could listen to your stories all day. And I can't wait to read your book.
Yeah. If only someone would write it, it'd be awesome. Let's ask the classic question for all Entity Framework people, which is code first or database first?
Yeah, so I'm a big fan of database, or let's just call it database. Just call it
schema first, maybe.
Schema first, maybe. Yes.
Yeah.
I think that's a better name, because it's like if you do the pitfall of doing model first is that unless you think schema, think about the data types and the sizes and the appropriate data type for each of your properties, you end up doing something wrong. Like the classical one is, of course, the fact that if you define something to be a string, it will end up as a varchar max property in field in the database.
Right.
Which I don't know. Maybe you don't know, but
which nobody actually wants.
Nobody really wants a string, a 2 gigabyte string for storing those 100.
Yeah. If you do want a 2 gigabyte string, stop that. Don't do that. That's store it as a blob. Everything's bad.
You shouldn't do that anyway. Not in the poor database. So do it somewhere else.
It's bad. Yeah. And I love the way you're describing this, Erik, because what you end up doing with code first then is being very clever about thinking about how you're going to make your schemas. And if you're going to think that way, just make the schemas.
Yeah, it's more descriptive.
Yeah, exactly. Because then you basically have to decorate your model with tiny fragments of something that looks basically like SQL, like in attributes or
schema hints,
in model codes, like small hints saying this isn't. I don't want this. I want to store this as a string, but I don't want any foreign characters in it. So I want it to be non-Unicode. So I have to use is Unicode false, and I want it to be only 250 characters. I want my dates to be as small as possible. So I want them to be like with less precision and so on.
Yeah, it's an easy way to do that is with create table.
Exactly.
Like it's a very easy way to do that.
Exactly.
It's very clear.
And the cool thing about it is there's actually in particular in the SQL Server area, which is my kind of area of expertise here, is there's really, really good tooling for doing that inside and outside of Visual Studio.
Yeah.
In Visual Studio and in Azure Data Studio.
SQL Management Studio even.
Yeah.
I still use that.
Even SQL Management Studio, but in particular, I'm really fond of doing it inside Visual Studio in what is called a database project, because you get like not only intelligence, like you can't write bad create table statements that don't build or compile or whatever you call it in the SQL world, or cannot execute anyway, but you also get like a cohesive understanding of your entire schema as part of that tooling. So if you're writing a view and you're referencing some other column and table from that view, you will not be able to write something pointing to a column that doesn't exist, because it knows your entire schema and can see that as a model and provide intelligence. And of course, the build, if you so wish, will fail if you are inconsistent and referring to things that don't exist.
Right.
You're stirring up memories for me. Matt Nunn, Road Trip. What was the nickname for that, for those data projects? There was a nickname for that technology in Visual Studio. God, we're old.
Data dude.
Data dude. That's it.
Data dude. Yeah, you got it. You pulled it out. Nice one.
Dude.
Data dude.
That's right.
And this was the beginning of treating that schema as source code.
Yeah.
Right. You no longer because you can't just drop a database and recreate it, the data, and it's important. And so the fact that Data Dude would take your modified schema, analyze your existing database, and write the alter statements for you.
Yeah.
You weren't storing the alter statements as schema. You were storing the new schema as schema.
Yeah.
But the tool would fix the two together. Like,
yeah, that was a magic juice.
Hugely powerful.
Yes. So I call it a desired state database, because you're describing at this point in time, in order to accommodate this new feature or whatever, I need these two additional tables, and I need an extra column, and I need a foreign key here and there, and so on. And this is part of my new feature. And so I want to describe, after I implemented my new feature, this is what I want the resulting schema to look like.
Nice.
Yeah.
So that's desired state. That's what I would call it. Yeah.
Yeah. No, and it's very compelling. And it's one of the arguments for code first is that it's just part of you keep it all part of your source code, but it's like, hey, a better way is let's make the schema part of the source code too, because it is declarative and coherent, and more people can work on it with you, and it creates great results for Entity Framework.
So, yeah.
Well, I'm glad we're in violent agreement, Erik. Thank goodness for that. I don't know where we were going to go.
What is
No.
What is DACFX?
So DACFX is actually an API that Microsoft publishes as a NuGet package, a .NET API,
Nice.
which allows you to manipulate the result of a database project. The output of a database project is something called a DAC pack, which is basically a zip file with some XML files inside it describing the schema. So this is what the tooling reads when it's applying the changes. It reads this DAC pack and compares it with a running production database.
That's .dacpac, by the way.
DACPAC, yes.
Yeah.
That framework allows you to create DAC packs programmatically and manipulate them and deploy them and so on from your own code.
So that is essentially taking the place of a create script, like a script creation tool.
Exactly. So it's taking the place of it's like a migration script or so on. So you can run this from your own code and do whatever you want. There's also a command line tool, which of course is just a thin layer over this API called SQL package, which is a .NET global tool you can install these days.
Wow, very cool.
And that will actually do like the publishing of your changes. And I have made tooling that part of the EF Core Power Tools feature set is that it can actually read the schema from a DAC pack and generate the database model from that instead of from a running database.
Nice.
Wow.
So you have I sometimes hear the term in a developer loop or whatever, that where you can actually create something with your create table statements and then just quickly run this tooling, and then it will update your C# model and C# entities based on the changes that you just made with your SQL statements.
Yeah, I like that. Very cool.
Well, and the more we can treat a database like it's just other code, part of the overall package, and goes with versions and so forth.
Yeah.
And most importantly, with that, it's sort of desired state mindset can be rolled back.
Exactly.
I mean, not recommended.
No, but
try
it's
not
possible.
to, but it is possible. The main thing that everyone's terrified around database is getting that deadlock state where it's like the old code won't run and the new code doesn't work. Like, what do we do?
Yeah.
Guys, let's take a quick break, and when we come back, I'm going to ask my question about my old pain. So stick around. We'll be right back. And we're back. You're listening to .NET Rocks. I'm Carl Franklin. That's Richard Campbell.
Howdy.
And that's Erik Ejlskov Jensen. And we're talking data. We're talking Entity Framework. And so here you go, Erik. When you're using Entity Framework and creating a context that you're going to use on a web backend, like say from an API controller, do you use tracking or do you turn it off?
It depends.
So there is a use case for tracking. On a web backend, because I always found it to be to get in the way. So what is that use case?
use it for update statements. But now there's this newfangled execute update API, so the use of it is probably less. Let's just step back.
Yeah,
so
give me a
maybe
scenario.
our listeners can understand why you are asking this question. So one of the major features of EF Core is also, apart from the ability to generate SQL statements based on your queries, is the ability to track changes to the entities that you hydrate from the database.
Yeah.
And it's using something called change tracker, which keeps a copy of everything you read and then compares. So when you're doing updates, it compares the properties, see what has changed. So it's only doing updates of things that have actually changed. So it's not like doing a blindfold update of everything.
Okay.
And of course, there's an overhead of running that. Like you're doing copies of data, and you have to, when you do saves, you have to do the comparison and to find out what needs to be updated and so on. So in app, and it's always on. You can switch it on, switch it off for your entire context in your configuration. But if you don't do that, it's always on. So you end up having a lot of as-no tracking statements in your code to turn it off for queries that simply gets stuff.
Yeah, I can't remember the issue that I was having, but I think it was when I went to go delete something. If some entity was out there that it was tracking,
Mm-hmm.
and I deleted it, it would complain. It wouldn't let me delete. Little things like that. And it's like, hey,
Yeah.
I'm the only programmer here,
Yeah,
right? Why are you giving me this trouble?
Why are you hurting me?
Yeah. So I always turned it off.
Mm-hmm. So, and now with EF Core 7, they've actually made two new APIs, one called execute delete and one called execute update.
Okay.
Which is like it's basically sugarcoating over a link way of phrasing a bulk update or bulk delete statement.
Okay.
And by bulk, it can also just hit one row. It doesn't have to hit many rows. But so and of course, then you kind of all this about change tracking. Forget about it, because you basically just phrasing a strongly typed update statement or a strongly typed delete statement, and it's not tracking anything.
Oh, I guess what's the benefit of tracking when you're only making calls into Entity Framework database from an API controller, and your data manager is a singleton, and like what's the point of tracking?
Before, when you had to do a delete or an update on an existing entity, you actually had to retrieve it first, and then do your remove method or your update your properties. So then you actually had to have tracking enabled, because otherwise EF Core wouldn't know about those. So if you were changing, it's like you have a record and you're changing a state column, for example, in a put method, then you would have to get the entity and change track it and say, I want to update the state from to whatever, completed or something like that, and then do a save changes. That was the only way you could do that if you weren't really keen on calling a stop procedure or writing raw SQL. But now with these two new APIs, you don't need to do that. If you just know the ID of the row to delete, for example, you would just formulate a link statement where the ID equals the ID that you just got in from the controller.
Yeah, now you're making me think that I wrote my stuff wrong because it worked. And and I had change tracking turned off.
We can do a code review later,
Yeah,
Carl.
I would love to. That'd be great. I admit that I'm not an entity framework expert, but I remember
people often end up with doing things like attach and update methods, and it's like things you should never really use.
Shouldn't be that hard.
No, exactly.
Yeah.
So yeah, but certainly the use of the change tracker as and tracking changes is really, really useful when you have a desktop app.
Yeah, a stateful app.
Stateful app.
Yeah.
And you have a long-lived DB context.
Yes.
And that is rarely the case in a web API scenario. Otherwise, you're doing it wrong anyway.
Any framework was designed during the age of WinForms and WPF, wasn't it?
Yeah,
so
exactly. So it's like WinForms, WPF, those kinds of like desktop apps, enterprise desktop apps, and there it made a lot of sense to say I will collect a number of changes on this form, and then I will do save changes. But unfortunately, the save changes.
Remember when we called them smart clients?
Yeah, I do.
Something like that.
And then just implied there were dumb clients.
Well,
and eventually, Entity Framework 6 would then issue 40 insert statements one by one.
Yeah.
And you would sit there.
Clunk, clunk, clunk.
Exactly.
Clunk.
So, yeah, it's improved since then. Yeah.
Yeah. And we write software differently, let's face it, right? Like it's interesting to think about trying to work in a more stateless way, the kind of normal, scalable approach to software.
But you say, it's stateful. We're talking stateful only for data, right? I mean, if you think about a Blazor application, right? A Blazor server application, there's state for every user, but it's not, you don't have long held, DB context for every user. That's crazy. Cause, you know, if you have, it's fine when you have one client, right? And you have a few long-running DB contexts, and that's all great when you're on a desktop app. But in a web app, you have, a million clients? You're not going to have it.
No.
It doesn't really scale.
No.
As the number of users rises above one,
you're in trouble.
Yes.
Yeah.
You're in trouble.
Yeah. So the team actually made a lot of improvements in that area also for like throughput and scalability, because they wanted to do better in a test suite called Tech Empower.
Right.
Where they are measuring against other frameworks and competitors, so to speak.
We've talked about this with Scott Hunter a number of times, that the .NET team as a whole was big on let's get good scores on Tech Empower, and the combination of like Razor pages on .NET, Razor pages on Linux, all those different kinds of setups, and you don't want to be the one left out.
No, exactly.
You don't want it to not be Entity Framework.
Exactly. And I mean, you can call that so it's turned out maybe they were tweaking stuff for the perp, or making very unusual choices about how they implemented stuff for the purpose of performance.
Pure performance. I'm looking at the number one .NET stack, bar chart right now on on Tech Empower. Coming in 9th is ASP Core on Linux with Postgres, raw database connectivity. So writing directly to the database.
Yeah.
I don't know that you do that, right? Like but
exactly.
It's a structure to get good performance.
Exactly. But I think you no matter why they did this, certainly any user of EF Core has benefited tremendously.
Sure, from that optimization.
From that optimization and the engineering effort that was put into that.
Yeah. Here's an Entity Framework one, and it's 38th. And again, still incredibly fast, right? Like the difference between the 38th position and the first position is a small number. But it's ASP.NET Core running on Linux with Postgres as a database with Entity Framework. Like that's a very reasonable stack.
It is not unusual in any way
to look at, and because you're talking, they call it full ORM, so it's like could be pointed at SQL, could be pointed at MySQL. Doesn't matter. I mean, performance is going to vary obviously, but just the fact that you can point at it and say it's in there, it's in the top 100. And it's so it runs in these extraordinarily high performance numbers. Admittedly, for an artificial test.
Constructed test. But nonetheless, So part of
it's good to have them there.
Every entity framework core provider, of course, needs an ADO.NET provider underneath it. That's
reality.
How Microsoft, that's a reality, and that's how Microsoft decided to build it, because otherwise it would never get anywhere. So they're using the existing groundwork of all the ADO.NET providers that are out there, and on top of that, you can build a provider for your database system.
Right.
And probably all know that the provider for SQL Server was System Data SQL Client.
Right.
Yeah.
And in .NET Framework, and it was actually also parts of it were ported to .NET Core very early in the .NET Core timeframe. But now Microsoft has actually open sourced all that, and they have created a standalone repository for the Microsoft client driver for SQL Server and Azure SQL, and it's called Microsoft Data SQL Client.
Right.
And I actually also contribute to that project.
Nice.
I don't know, of course, but I do. So that's also a very interesting development. The problem with that project is that it's like a two-headed beast. It has a .NET Core, .NET branch. It has .NET versions of all the classes, and it has .NET Framework versions of multiple classes, and they're trying to merge those two, but it's basically like a two-headed beast, and it's the .NET Framework code base, of course, is like, yes, you can see Scott Guthrie's signature in there somewhere or whatever. It's like 2000 and something one or whatever, or before that even.
Yeah.
Of course, the .NET Core code base is newer, but just because .NET Core is newer, but then it's also a little bit quirky because they had to not add a lot of features for the first iterations of that .NET Core, because it just didn't have feature parity with .NET Framework at that point. And now they're trying to move them back. So it's really part of the performance, of course, also hinges on the performance of that driver.
Right.
And it's a quirky code base. I contribute to it myself, and the team is really good, and they're making a big effort. But it is what it is, and they can't just rip it away and start over.
No.
So what is happening now, which I think is extremely interesting, is that the EF Core team, I assume in collaboration with some people from the SQL team, is actually creating a new provider completely from scratch, using all the newfangled low memory APIs like spans and zero allocation APIs for reading stuff directly from the wire and so on.
So I imagine it'll surface as a lightweight provider with a limited set of functionality.
It will surface definitely surface as a lightweight provider, and I don't think the intention is to ever support all like SQL bulk copy, SQL dependency. You have all these kind of classes that have emerged one by one in the classic SQL client, and that will not be part of it.
Sure.
But
it's no different than parts of the original .NET Framework never made it to Core because they were too dependent on ISAPI filters or Windows specific stuff.
Yeah.
Windows registry, stuff like that.
Yeah.
So but it came later in additional packages and things you could add on.
But I could also imagine once this thing is shipped, you'll use it where you can, and where you must use the original one, you will. There's no reason not to use both. If you've got a chunk of code dependent on bulk copy, you'll use the old one. If you don't care about performance, you're using bulk copy.
Yep.
But for the lightweight, scaling, nobody does massive millions of bulk copy operations. They do a few. It'll be in a min client thing.
Yeah, or maybe they will just do it from the command line or something like that.
Yeah.
Not necessarily in something that's just running all the time.
Like that time when we moved all our data from our SQL Server to Azure. Remember that? We were in New Zealand.
Yeah, I remember that. And it went so well.
It did. Yeah. Kind of. So speaking of performance, I want to know your thoughts on Dapper, the open source ORM, and Dapper Contrib, which is another library that adds link to Dapper. So Dapper is a lightweight wrapper around ADO.NET.
And this is DAPPER, not DAPR.
Correct. Right. And it's fast, and people, when it came out, were saying it's faster than Entity Framework, and it was for a while. And then when the new Entity Framework came out, people were telling me that the performance was on par with Dapper. I haven't tested it, of course, but that's what they were saying. So what do you think about it?
I think it really served a purpose at one point in time where there was people suffering from performance issues with in particular with Entity Framework, but also the initial iterations of EF Core certainly had room for improvement.
Yeah.
That is no longer the case. There's been, as we talked about with this Tech Empower effort that has been taking place, there's been a lot of work done in that area, and the query performance is definitely on par with Dapper.
And therefore ADO.NET. Yeah.
Yes. Dapper has the ability to serialize any class you have in your code, so populate any class you have in your code from a SQL query.
Yes.
And that has not been a feature of EF Core until EF Core 8, which is coming later this year.
Cool.
So you can take any class you have in your code and serialize it. I don't think it supports advanced things like multiple result sets like Dapper does, and that's probably not coming. So if you have a need for that, like consume multiple sub result sets from a stored procedure or something like that, then Dapper certainly still has a place. I'm speaking for myself, but I really like that. I don't have to have too many dependencies that does something that's almost the same thing.
Yeah.
Right.
Also, you're kind of locked into SQL Server with Dapper because it's really for SQL, isn't it? Or does it work with any ADO.NET?
I think it supports. No, it supports it supports a number of ADO providers.
Okay, that makes sense because it's a wrapper on ADO.NET.
Yeah, no, it's just a wrapper over DB connection actually.
Yeah.
So it supports a lot of ADO.NET providers.
Got it. Yeah.
But still, it's nice to know that. I think it gives me great confidence to know that the stack I'm using can do everything I want to do.
Right.
From raw SQL, mapping stored procedures, mapping random classes in my code, to advanced link queries.
And I appreciate the idea that they've optimized enough of EF that they're now looking at the providers because that's where the wins are going to come.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting development that now they can't really do more because of just how .NET works. You can only do so much.
Oh yeah, no. Stephen Taub has done all the things.
Exactly.
Like the optimization options are diminishing.
Yeah.
And written 200-page blog posts about it. So yes.
It's amazing. Yeah.
Yeah.
If I just, it's one of those blog posts like, if I just trust you in using new code, will you not make me read this, please? It's complicated. The only thing worse than it's that long is it's so complex.
Yeah.
Like if you ever wanted proof that optimized code is more difficult to read, right? There's a reason why we use these abstractions like Entity Framework and so forth to make data access simpler. Yeah, raw calls would be faster, but would you read that code?
No.
Right? You don't want to look at optimized code.
I don't want to
Optimized
write
code
it
makes you sad.
Yeah. You just want to use it.
Yeah, exactly.
I just wanted to benefit from it. I switched up to .NET 7 and my stuff was faster.
All right.
Just ran faster. Yeah.
So speaking of .NET 7, let's say we got some old EF6 running on .NET Framework. We want to move it into .NET 7 or even .NET 8 or even .NET 6. I mean, what is involved in doing that? Is it going to be as painful as I think?
Actually, at one point, the EF team created a .NET Standard 2.1 version of EF6 Classic, which means that you can actually run EF6 on .NET Core or .NET 6 or 7 or 8. Yes. That code base, that provider is, of course, SQL Server only. And it also still uses the legacy system data SQL client.
Okay.
So it doesn't get all like, if there's a new version of SQL Server that requires some client changes, they will not be incorporated because that piece of software is only maintained for top security issues and nothing else. So it's basically in maintenance mode.
Could you use it as a stepping stone? Where would you go from there?
I publish a EF6 provider, which bridges the gap, so you can take advantage of this new Microsoft Data SQL client driver we just spoke about, and it of course supports all the always encrypted technology that's come recently with the SQL Server. It supports all the authentication methods, the new authentication methods against Azure SQL, like managed identity, which allows you to create passwordless connections from your app service, for example, to an Azure SQL database, similar to what you were used to on premises with integrated security and so on. And that's not very good supported in System Data SQL Client, but of course it's fully supported in Microsoft Data SQL. So iProp is an alternative provider that bridges the gap. And I was actually recently just fortunate enough to have a pull request accepted for Entity Framework 6 that will publish what I did as a supported Microsoft provider for that uses Microsoft Data SQL Client instead of System Data SQL. So you get all the benefit of like SQL Server 2022 also introduced a new over-the-wire protocol that works better with firewalls called TDS8. You can Google it and read about it, but in order to get that support, so it's more better encryption of what happens over the wire. Even login process is encrypted. It wasn't before. So and in order to get that, you didn't need the latest client driver, and my package, which is currently published and supported, but only by me, not by Microsoft, is certainly a stepping stone that can help you there.
That's very cool. So you've got all these extensions and open source tools and products. We'll add links to them, of course, but what about somebody who's writing extensions and wants to get into Visual Studio? Do you have any advice for them?
Yes. Follow Mads Christensen. He's a program manager on the Visual Studio team, and he has...
and a regular on the show.
Yes. And he has published a lot of content about extensibility. He had some workshops where he took you through creating an extension completely from scratch.
Nice.
In Visual Studio with serving various purposes. And a lot of what he did in his basement there was actually ended up being published extensions. So if you prefer to do viewing stuff on YouTube or similar media, then that's definitely the way to go. And he's really, really good at explaining stuff.
Yeah, he is.
And there is a library that can also help you, because it is a little bit of it can quickly become a little bit of a black back art. But Mads Christensen, together with some other clever guys at Microsoft, has created a tool called the Visix Community Toolkit, which is a library that makes it easy to do things that you would normally do as an extension writer, and not having to find out this is this interface and you have to convert it to this implementation and then call this and that method and put a href and get a non-zero code back from this object and so on. All that is wrapped nicely for you in this library. So doing things like showing messages in Visual Studio, addressing the status bar, and putting up yellow bars and things like that you want to do from your extension becomes basically a one-liner using that library.
Nice.
So that's definitely my recommendation. The best way to get started with that.
Follow Mads.
Well, this is all Danish mafia stuff, right? Like all
Of
you
course.
guys.
Yeah.
And what I appreciate about Mads Christensen is he walks the walk. Like that dude's got a lot of extensions. Like there's a reason why he can explain it so well. He does the work.
He does it. Yeah. I mean, it must be huge effort for him just to keep all his extensions current.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, and his add file extension, essentially that made it into Visual Studio.
Mm-hmm. Many of his extensions has gradually paved their way into Visual Studio one by one. So it's very cool.
Very cool indeed. Yeah. So what's next for you, my friend? What are you working on?
The EF Core Power Tools, which has about 300,000 installs currently in Visual Studio.
Wow,
and that of course is it makes me very proud, but it's still Windows only. You need Visual Studio on Windows in order to use it. Recently, somebody said, "Oh, can this run on ARM?" It could. So now that Visual Studio runs on ARM, so yeah.
Yes.
But it's still limited to Windows, of course. So the next thing I'm working on is actually taking that. So as I said earlier, I'm basing my tooling on the scaffolding API, if you wish, that EF Core provides. But I'm adding a lot of additional features, and all those additional features, I would like to make them available to other users on other platforms. So next for me is basically thinking about creating a command line version of EF Core Power Tools.
Nice.
And of course, some people ask me, is there a GUI for this in Visual Studio Code? Well, at least I give the groundwork for somebody to maybe, I don't know anything about JavaScript or so. I wouldn't know where to start. So.
Hey, we will not fault you for that.
But somebody else can then wrap my command line tool in some nice configuration GUI to show my configuration file in there. So it will be a big stepping stone for me, and also quite exciting for me because I've never really. If something ran on other platforms that I created, it was by accident. It was not intentional. So I'm really looking forward to that. Yeah.
That's great. Well, Erik Jensen, it's been a delight to have you on the show, and thank you for all your hard work and great dissemination of this complex topic. It's great to be talking to you.
Fantastic. Thanks for having me.
All right, and we'll talk to you next time on .NET Rocks. .NET Rocks is brought to you by Franklin's Net and produced by Plop Studios, a full-service audio, video, and post-production facility located physically in New London, Connecticut, and of course in the cloud. Online at pwop.com. Visit our website at dotnetrocks.com for RSS feeds, downloads, mobile apps, comments, and access to the full archives going back to show number 1, recorded in September 2002. And make sure you check out our sponsors. They keep us in business. Now go write some code. See you next time. Got transmitter bands by the FCC. Yes, I'm a